$1 million settlement, the heart-wrenching pain of a shattered soul, and a gloomy morning in the heart of Philadelphia. Do you have the courage to step into Vanessa's breathless journey, where the cold stares of the police conceal a dark conspiracy waiting to be uncovered? Vanessa woke up in her small apartment in Philadelphia. The pale light, seeping through thin curtains, cast faint streaks across the old wooden floor. The distant sound of car horns from the street mingled with the hurried footsteps of early commuters. The city never slept, but for Vanessa, it had never truly welcomed her. She pulled the thin blanket off her body, feeling the lingering chill from the night before clinging to her skin. Another new day had begun, but she couldn't shake the heavy feeling in her chest, something invisible but palpable, as though some kind of omen was creeping through the cracks of her life. Her apartment had little to offer, just a few old items picked up from a thrift store on the corner. A small table next to the kitchen still held the scent of pastry she had tried to bake the night before, a new recipe she hoped would someday become the signature dish of her own bakery. But that dream still seemed distant, buried under unpaid bills and the meager paycheck from her job at the bookstore. She stepped into the small bathroom and looked into the cracked mirror, seeing her own reflection, eyes dark from sleepless nights, her lightly curled hair hanging over her shoulders, and a face that couldn't hide the exhaustion. She told herself that today would be better, but an eerie feeling lingered in her mind. Vanessa dressed in her familiar navy blue shirt, adjusting the collar before throwing on a light jacket. The new day began like any other, but she felt something was different. It wasn't fear exactly, but an unsettling sense of unease, as if she were stepping into a play where she didn't know the script. She took a deep breath, grabbed her handbag, and left the apartment, the wooden door creaking as it closed behind her. The narrow hallway led down to the metal stairs, where the weak yellow light from the ceiling wasn't enough to chase away the shadows in the corners. She was used to this, an old building with residents either heading to work early or just coming back from the night shift, no one really paying attention to anyone else. Stepping onto the street, the cold morning air hit her face, snapping her back to reality. Philadelphia was as busy as ever, people flooding the streets, each with a place to go, something to do. She tightened her grip on her handbag and walked slowly toward the Starbucks on the corner, where she often stopped for coffee before heading to the bookstore. Vanessa tightened her coat as the cold wind swept through Market Street, carrying with it the faint mist of a morning still not fully awake. She quickened her pace, trying to shake off the lingering unease that had gripped her since leaving her apartment. The sounds of traffic, the hurried footsteps of those rushing to work, all blended together, creating the usual hustle of the city. But today, everything seemed oddly unfamiliar, as though something was out of place. There was something in the air, something invisible yet heavy, tightening around her chest. Starbucks appeared at the corner, its glass door reflecting the pale light of the morning. Vanessa pushed the door open, stepping into the warmth inside, greeted by the rich aroma of coffee and the smell of freshly baked pastries. The space was brightly lit, with customers quietly sitting by their laptops, others whispering softly in the corners. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that this was just a regular morning. A cup of coffee, then the bookstore, and then the day would pass like any other. But as she approached the counter, that same feeling crept back, this time more intense. A cold, piercing gaze locked onto her, so strong that she could almost feel it, like a chill brushing against her neck. Instinctively, she looked up, and then she saw them. Two police officers, James and Ryan, stood near the counter, getting sugar and milk for their coffee. But instead of focusing on their drinks, their eyes were fixed on her. There was no hiding it, no pretense of coincidence. Their gaze wasn't just curious. It was scrutinizing, judgmental, and suspicious. A dull ache spread through Vanessa's chest as she realized what was happening. She knew this look. She had seen it in wealthier neighborhoods where people like her were considered strangers. She had encountered it in interrupted conversations, in being followed around stores for no reason. And now, here it was again, right here in what was supposed to be an ordinary morning. She swallowed hard, telling herself that maybe she was imagining things. Maybe they were just looking around. Maybe they were waiting for someone. But her heart refused to listen to reason. It thudded loudly, out of rhythm, as if warning her that something wasn't right. She tightened her grip on her purse, lowered her head, and focused on the counter to place her order. A hot latte, just like every day? Simple. Just finish this, and then she could leave, return to the routine of everyday life. The money was handed over, the transaction completed. Vanessa stepped back, waiting. But even without looking directly at them, she could still feel their gaze on her, following her like a shadow. She overheard them whispering to each other, their voices low, carrying an unsettling tone that she couldn't explain. The barista called her name, the sound cutting through the bustling space. Vanessa hurried forward, took the latte, feeling the warmth through the paper cup. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm. There was nothing wrong, just a regular morning, just a cup of coffee before work. But as she turned to leave, her gaze inadvertently met theirs once again. And this time, James didn't look away. He continued staring, his eyes hard, with an intensity that was almost frightening, as if he had seen something only he knew. A faint, inscrutable smile passed over Ryan's lips before they whispered to each other once more. Vanessa felt her heart skip a beat. She turned away quickly and hurried out of the cafe. The air outside was colder, but it did nothing to calm the storm rising inside her chest. She hadn't done anything wrong. She had no reason to be afraid. And yet, her steps quickened, and her heart couldn't shake the feeling that those two hadn't let her go. Vanessa stepped out of Starbucks, taking a deep breath, trying to steady herself. But the morning air no longer offered any comfort. The wind blew through the towering buildings, carrying with it a chill that seeped into her bones. She gripped the coffee cup tighter in her hand, the warmth from it seeming to be the only thing anchoring her to reality. But no matter how hard she tried to ignore it, a strange sensation clung to her, a feeling as if someone was watching her. She walked down the sidewalk, blending into the bustling crowd, but her steps unconsciously quickened. The sounds of the city, the honking cars, the chatter of pedestrians, the clink of carts selling hot buns suddenly felt distant, as if she were sinking into another space, a place where only she and some unseen danger existed. She didn't want to look back, but her instincts urged her to check. And then, when she caught a glimpse of herself in the glass of a store window, she saw them, James and Ryan, the two police officers from Starbucks. They were walking just a few steps behind her, their gaze no longer concealed. They were following her. Vanessa's heart began to race, her hand tightening around the coffee cup until her fingers ached. A part of her wanted to believe it was just a coincidence, that they were just another set of people walking down the street like everyone else. But no, their steps were too synchronized, not hurried like the others rushing to work, and they didn't seem to be heading toward any particular destination. They walked as if they were waiting for her to make a mistake. Each step Vanessa took felt heavier, each breath more difficult. Memories flooded back like a crashing wave. Those times she'd been stopped in stores simply for looking suspicious, the scrutinizing stares when she entered wealthier neighborhoods, her grandmother's warnings that as a black woman, she would always have to work twice as hard to be treated as an equal. And now, in the middle of this crowded street, that pain resurfaced, tightening around her like an invisible noose. Vanessa took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. She couldn't let fear control her. This was Philadelphia, a busy city, not a dark, deserted alley. They couldn't do anything to her here. But her mind told her one thing, and her body reacted in another way. Cold sweat ran down her spine, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it thumping in her chest. She turned onto a smaller street, the one that led to the bookstore where she worked. If she could just get inside, if she could just reach Gina, if she could lose herself in the familiar space of the bookshelves and the smell of old paper, maybe she would feel safer. But as she turned onto the street, she realized they were still right behind her. No doubt about it. Her breathing grew shallow. A thought flashed through her mind. If they stopped her now, who would believe her? A black woman walking quickly, with fear in her eyes. A runaway. She had seen too many cases like this in the news, heard too many stories of people being wrongfully accused just because they didn't fit society's narrow biases. Vanessa tightened her grip on her purse, her steps quickening, trying not to show her fear. But deep down, she knew the real nightmare had begun, and this time, she wasn't sure if she would make it out safely. The air inside the bookstore always gave Vanessa a sense of peace, a place where she could temporarily escape the chaos outside. The soft golden light spilled over the wooden shelves, the scent of old paper blending with the aroma of coffee from the half-drunk latte sitting on the counter. She stood in the corner of the store, carefully reorganizing a stack of newly arrived novels, trying to focus on her work, to forget the unsettling feeling that had been lingering since this morning. But just as her fingers brushed over the spine of a book, a cold voice rang out from the doorway, pulling her back into reality. "Come with us." The words weren't loud, but in the quiet of the bookstore, they cut through the peaceful atmosphere like a knife. All movement around her seemed to stop. Vanessa looked up, and her heart dropped to the pit of her stomach when she saw James and Ryan standing right at the entrance. They didn't bother to pretend to be polite. James's gaze remained as sharp as it had been earlier, while Ryan stood with his arms crossed, his face devoid of emotion except for suspicion. No one needed to say anything more. Vanessa immediately understood. They hadn't just happened to be here. They had been following her, and now they wanted to turn their suspicion into reality, even though they had no proof. The store seemed to hold its breath. A few customers near the counter turned their heads slightly, their gazes wavering between curiosity and concern. Some stopped in the aisles, pretending to look at books, but actually listening intently. The silence grew heavy, as if the entire room was waiting to see what would happen next. Vanessa could feel dozens of eyes drilling into her, one after the other, like sharp knives, causing her throat to tighten. "What's going on?" Gina's voice broke through from behind the counter, snapping Vanessa out of her paralyzing shock. She looked toward Gina, the only manager here she could trust right now. Gina was staring at the two officers with a look of suspicion, her hands resting on the counter as if ready to step in if anything went wrong. "We need to speak with her privately," James emphasized, his tone even but carrying an oppressive weight. "It's in connection with a recent theft." Vanessa's heart skipped a beat, a wave of indignation flooding her chest. "Theft?" She frowned, her voice catching with shock. "I haven't stolen anything." Ryan crossed his arms tighter, his voice calm but overwhelming. A witness described the suspect as having a similar appearance to hers. "Similar appearance to mine?" Vanessa felt a bitter taste rise in her throat. She knew exactly what they meant. Similar appearance to mine, a veiled reference to a black woman in plain clothes, someone easily suspected because of her skin color. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms to stop herself from trembling. No, she wouldn't let them walk all over her like this. "I've been working here all morning," she said, her voice colder than before. "Everyone here can vouch for that. I have no reason to steal." Gina stepped forward, standing partially between Vanessa and the officers. "She's been working, and I can confirm that," she said firmly. "If you have any specific evidence, I suggest you present it. Otherwise, I don't see why you're bothering my staff." James and Ryan exchanged a brief look, but there was no sign of retreat. The customers in the store remained silent, but the atmosphere had shifted. Some looked at Vanessa with pity, others with hesitation, as if unsure what to believe. Vanessa could feel the quiet judgment in their stares, the awful sensation of becoming the target of unfounded suspicion. James lowered his voice, but didn't lose any of his menace. "We're not asking. We're ordering. Come with us." Vanessa glanced around, feeling like she was trapped in an invisible cage. If she refused, what could they do? If she followed them, what would happen? A sense of helplessness surged inside her, but she knew she couldn't let them control her fate. Taking a deep breath, she looked James squarely in the eye. "If I go, I want someone to come with me." Gina immediately stepped forward, her voice determined. "I'll go with her." James pursed his lips, his expression flashing with dissatisfaction, but then he nodded. "Fine." Vanessa glanced over the customers in the store one last time before turning and walking away, feeling their eyes still on her. She knew that no matter what she did, these unfounded accusations had left a deep wound in her heart, a wound that wouldn't be easily erased. And as she stepped through the glass door into the street, one thought flashed in her mind. This nightmare was far from over. The morning air on Market Street was colder as Vanessa stepped out of the bookstore, but it wasn't the chill of the weather that made her shiver. It was the palpable tension in the air, tightening around her like an invisible noose. The glass door behind her shut, cutting her off from the fragile safety inside the store. The sounds of the city seemed to fade away, the honking of cars, the hurried footsteps of commuters, even the casual chatter of pedestrians. The only thing left in the space was one voice, cold and sharp, James's. "Don't pretend to be innocent," he shouted, his tone no longer restrained as it had been before. Vanessa froze, feeling every muscle in her body tense with shock. Before she could speak, James stepped closer, his gaze burning with a judgment she couldn't comprehend. Ryan stood behind him, arms crossed, silent, but his eyes held no warmth. They didn't need evidence, nor a clear reason. They only needed one thing, her presence here. "I've told you already." Vanessa forced her voice to remain calm, though she couldn't hide the tremor. "I haven't done anything wrong. I've been working at the bookstore all morning. You can check the security cameras if you need to." But her words carried no weight. She could see in James's eyes that everything she said meant nothing, not because he hadn't heard her, but because he didn't care. "Do you think you can fool us?" James sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "We have a witness. Someone saw a woman with a similar appearance to yours at the scene of the theft." Vanessa stiffened. "A woman with a similar appearance to hers." The words hit her like a slap across the face. No name, no specific description, no image to prove it. Just an anonymous witness and a vague description so broad that any black woman on this street could be the suspect. Vanessa clenched her fists, a simmering anger rising within her chest. This wasn't just a mistake. This was prejudice, a system so deeply entrenched in discrimination that all she could do was become part of it, a part of the endless list of people suspected, blamed, and seen as guilty even when they'd done nothing wrong. "Is that so?" Her voice dropped, eyes cold as she stared directly at James. "How did that witness describe me? A black woman in a blue shirt? Or just someone who looked suspicious?" James pressed his lips together but didn't respond. Gina, still standing nearby, took a step forward, her voice sharper than ever. "I can't believe this. You're really dragging one of my employees out of her own store just because of an unfounded accusation like this." Ryan spoke, his voice the first to break the silence since they stepped outside. "We're just doing our job." Vanessa scoffed, a dry, humorless laugh escaping her lips. "Doing your job? What's your job? To accuse innocent people just because their skin color doesn't match yours." A flicker of discomfort passed over Ryan's face, but he didn't respond. James, on the other hand, made no attempt to hide his irritation. He stepped closer, his eyes glaring fiercely. "You're saying that because you're scared, aren't you?" A heavy silence hung in the air. A few passers-by started to notice, their curious eyes flicking toward the scene. A middle-aged man standing nearby furrowed his brow, while a young woman clutched her purse tighter and took a step back. Whispers began to ripple through the crowd, spreading like a wave. Vanessa's heart raced, but she didn't back down. This was no longer just about her. This was about all the time she had been seen as a threat simply because of her skin color. This was about a system built to oppress rather than protect. James glanced around, realizing they were drawing the attention of the crowd. He took a deep breath, his eyes still burning with unspent fury. "We'll be back," he growled, the words a threat hanging in the air. "And when we do, you won't get off so easily." Then he turned, and Ryan hesitated for a moment before following. Both walked away, leaving Vanessa standing there, her hands clenched so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She didn't say anything. She just stood there, listening to the sound of their footsteps fading, but unable to shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Vanessa stepped back into the bookstore like a lost soul in her own world. The glass door softly closed behind her, but it couldn't stop the coldness tightening around her from the inside. Everything around her became blurry. The sounds of people buying books, the rustle of pages turning, even the soft background music no longer brought a sense of peace. Her heart still couldn't beat at a normal rhythm, each breath coming in sharp gasps, as if she had just escaped a nightmare. But she knew it wasn't over. She staggered toward the counter, where Sarah, her colleague, stood with a look of deep concern in her eyes. Gina was still there, her face flushed with anger after everything that had happened outside, but Vanessa couldn't bear to accept any more emotions right now. Her legs were shaking, and when she reached the edge of the counter, she sank down, pulling her knees up and wrapping her arms around them. "Vanessa?" Sarah whispered, her voice soft like a passing breeze. But Vanessa couldn't respond right now. Her hands were still trembling, and if she tried to hold her coffee, it would definitely spill all over the floor. Her chest tightened as though an invisible cord was wrapping around her heart, squeezing tighter with every beat. Gina sat next to her, placing a hand on her back as if to offer some warmth, some strength. They had no right to do that to you. We'll find a way. No, Vanessa whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She looked up at them, her eyes red from the tears she had yet to shed. There's no way. Sarah sat down beside her, taking her hand. Don't say that, Vanessa. We'll prove you're innocent. You don't have to go through this alone. But how could they understand? They could be angry for her. They could want to help her, but they weren't her. They didn't know what it felt like to step outside and always be looked at with suspicion. They didn't know what it was like to have your dignity stripped away simply because of your skin color. If it wasn't me today, it would have been someone else, she said, her voice weak but carrying deep bitterness. They don't need a reason. They just need a face that fits their prejudice. Sarah sighed, tightening her grip on Vanessa's hand. Our community has fought for justice for years, Vanessa, and you're not fighting alone. But she felt alone. She felt like a shadow lost in this world. No one really saw her. No one really cared about her pain. They could sympathize, but no one could understand what it felt like to be rejected by society, to be seen as a threat even when you had done nothing wrong. She clenched both her hands, her nails digging deep into her skin, as if she could somehow feel physical pain to drown out the pain in her chest. But it didn't help. Why did she have to feel like this? Why did she have to prove her innocence when she hadn't done anything wrong? Why was a system that was supposed to protect citizens turning people like her into targets? Gina spoke again, her voice quieter now, but no less firm. Vanessa, you can't let them win. Vanessa looked up at her, her eyes still distant. Gina nodded. The ones who think you don't deserve to be treated fairly. The ones who think you're not strong enough to stand up to them. Vanessa took a deep breath, but her chest still felt empty. She didn't know if she had the strength to fight anymore. But one thing she knew for sure. She couldn't let herself be completely defeated. Outside the glass door, the sunlight continued to slip through the buildings. But for Vanessa, the world had never felt as dark as it did now. Vanessa couldn't remember the last time she felt at ease. From the moment James and Ryan stepped into the bookstore, her life had veered down an entirely different path. She was no longer the girl trying to build her dream of owning a bakery. She wasn't the hard-working employee loved by customers. She had become a name whispered on the street, a topic of gossip spreading like an uncontrollable wildfire. Rumors traveled faster than the truth. When she stepped out of the bookstore during her lunch break, the cold wind was no longer the only thing that made her shiver. She could hear them, the voices, quiet but sharp, whispers that seemed harmless yet cut deep into her soul like a knife. She's definitely guilty. A woman standing at the street corner whispered to her friend, but her eyes followed Vanessa's every move. The police wouldn't just accuse someone without a reason. A man who had just come out of the convenience store shook his head, his voice full of doubt. I don't know, but she does look like a thief, another person chimed in. Vanessa felt as if the ground beneath her feet had just collapsed. Her breath caught in her chest, her hand instinctively clutching the strap of her bag, as if it was the only thing holding her upright. There was nothing she could do except keep walking, trying to ignore the eyes silently following her. But no matter how fast she walked, no matter how much she tried to remain composed, she couldn't escape those whispers. The heart-wrenching pain wasn't just from being falsely accused. It came from the betrayal of the very people she had once trusted. Philadelphia might be a big city, but in the smaller neighborhoods, people still knew each other, still formed a community she had once believed would protect one another. But now, that very community was turning its back on her. The people who once greeted her with a smile as she served them at the bookstore, the ones who had asked her about her dream of opening a bakery, now they looked at her with wary eyes, as though they had never really known who she was. Vanessa had once believed that if anything happened, she would have people standing by her side. But when she saw familiar faces avoid her gaze, when she heard footsteps slow every time she passed by, she realized that sometimes cruelty didn't come from strangers. It came from the very people she had hoped would understand her. She walked faster, her eyes burning but refusing to let herself cry. She had spent her entire life trying to prove herself, to show people that she wasn't just a black woman in a city full of prejudice, but a person with dreams and aspirations. But it seemed none of that mattered anymore. One rumor, One baseless accusation, and everything she had worked for had been erased in a single day. She couldn't go back to the way things were. But the scariest part was that she didn't know where to go from here. The darkness enveloped the small apartment, with only the faint light from the street lamps casting dim shadows through the window, reflecting off the worn mirror in front of Vanessa. She sat motionless, her gaze locked onto her own reflection. Yet, what she saw wasn't the familiar face she had known for so many years. The woman in the mirror looked hollow, her eyes deeply sunken, filled with unspoken sorrow, as if the world had crushed her in a single day, reshaping her into someone else entirely. It was as if the life she once knew, her hopes, her dreams, her essence, had been erased in one fell swoop. Her fingers grazed lightly across the glass, but she wasn't just tracing the cold surface of the mirror. She was reaching for something deeper, something that had been haunting her for as long as she could remember, the question that had followed her all her life. Am I worthy of being treated like this? Her mind screamed in defiance. No, the answer should have been simple. But her heart was no longer sure. It was tangled in uncertainty. What had she done wrong? Was it because of the color of her skin? Was it because she lived in a world where just one glance, one judgment, could decide her fate? Was she really so different, so wrong, that she deserved to be treated this way? The whispers from the morning still reverberated in her mind, every word like a sharp sting to her pride, to her dignity. They weren't just voices. They were daggers, embedding themselves deep inside her, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't stop the bleeding. Vanessa had grown up with the lessons of strength and resilience. She had been taught to rise above, to be the woman who stood tall, refusing to let anyone define her by the color of her skin. She had learned that her worth was not determined by other people's narrow-minded judgments. But today those lessons seemed distant and fragile in the face of this overwhelming, unrelenting reality. Did those lessons really offer protection? Could she stand firm against this kind of injustice? Or was the weight of her own heart breaking under the pressure? A part of her, so deeply tired and mournful, just wanted to surrender. She wanted to disappear. She wanted to retreat into the darkness, to stop facing the world, to stop walking outside and meeting the cold, skeptical eyes that followed her every move. She wanted to escape the heavy burden of being constantly scrutinized, of being always questioned, of being always seen as the other. But another part of her, the part she had buried deep inside, refused to give in. It fought to rise up, to push back against this weight that was dragging her down. It was the part that screamed, I am not a victim. I am not a scapegoat. I won't let them break me. But then, what did fighting really mean? Did it mean enduring even more of the cold stares, the whispered judgments, the invisible walls people would build around her? Did it mean accepting that her life, her future, would never be the same again, that her name would forever be tainted by rumors and lies? The fear of that truth loomed over her, suffocating, dark, and suffused with an unspoken weight. The terror was almost paralyzing. Yet, buried beneath the fear, there was something else, a spark of determination, a flicker of defiance igniting within her. She closed her eyes and took a long, shuddering breath, trying to steady herself, trying to find the balance between despair and fury. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. She didn't know if she had the strength to keep fighting. The uncertainty of it all clawed at her insides, making her feel small, helpless, isolated. But deep down, there was one thing she knew for sure. She would not let herself be swallowed by this fear. She would not let the shadows of doubt claim her entirely. She would not let them win. Vanessa opened her eyes and stared at her reflection once more. There she was, still Vanessa, but not the same as before, not the girl who had been willing to shrink away in silence. The woman who looked back at her in the mirror was different, stronger, more determined, though scarred and broken. But the fire that burned within her would not be extinguished. Not now. Not ever. Vanessa remained motionless before the mirror, her hand gripping the edge of the chair, as if it were the only thing holding her to reality. The inner conflict raged inside her, the tug of war between two opposing thoughts pushing her deeper into an unending battle within herself. A part of her wanted to give up, wanted to let fate carry her away, because no matter how hard she tried, it seemed useless. But another part of her couldn't accept that. She couldn't live with her head bowed forever. She couldn't let those who had humiliated her win. As she sat trapped in her thoughts, lost in the turmoil that seemed to have no end, a soft knock on the door broke the suffocating silence, pulling her out of the spiral of despair. Vanessa slowly stood up, her legs heavy as though she had just fought a battle. She opened the door, and there stood Gina, accompanied by a woman she had never met before. The woman had a confident air, yet without arrogance. Her long, curly hair framed a sharp, perceptive face, and her eyes seemed as though they could see through everything. Gina offered a soft smile, one laced with a fragile sense of hope. "Vanessa, this is Emily Carter. She's a civil rights attorney. I think she can help you." Civil rights attorney. Vanessa blinked, a surge of doubt rising within her. Was anyone truly able to help her? Or was this just another fleeting hope? But when Emily extended her hand to shake hers, there was a firm, assured grip in her handshake, a steadiness Vanessa hadn't expected. "I've heard about what's been happening," Emily said, her voice deep but full of conviction. "And I believe you." Just 3 simple words, but they hit Vanessa like a lightning strike through the fog of her mind. I believe you. Not doubt. Not the scrutinizing stare she had endured for days. Just trust. A trust she thought she might never find again. Her throat tightened as though something was lodged inside. But this time, it wasn't pain. It was a sense of lightness, a faint glimmer of hope amid the darkness. But as soon as she felt that flicker of hope, another question echoed in her mind. Would this light be enough to pull her out of the abyss? She had lost so much, had been hurt so deeply. She wanted to believe in Emily, wanted to believe that justice could stand on her side. But after everything that had happened, how could she be sure she wasn't just deluding herself? Emily seemed to read the doubt in Vanessa's eyes. "I'm not saying the road ahead will be easy," she continued, her gaze sharp yet gentle. "But you don't have to walk it alone. I'm here to help you fight." Vanessa stared at the woman before her, trying to find something, some sign, some proof of the truth in her words. And then, in that fleeting moment, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, a little hope. Maybe it wasn't enough to chase away all the darkness, but it was there. And sometimes, just one tiny spark is all it takes to ignite a fire. Vanessa sat across from Emily in the small, dimly lit office, where the soft yellow light fell on the wooden desk, creating a quiet yet determined atmosphere. For the first time in days, she didn't feel alone. Emily had spent the entire morning taking detailed notes, her sharp eyes skimming through each page as though she were mapping out a strategy. Every question was asked with eerie precision, but also with a profound empathy. Unlike all the times she had faced judgmental stares, this time the person in front of her truly wanted to listen. Vanessa recounted everything. From the moment she stepped into Starbucks, the cold stares of James and Ryan, to their eerie obsession as they watched her from a distance. She described the moment they showed up in the bookstore, accusing her without evidence, and the shame of being dragged out in front of people she once thought would have her back. Each word felt like a blade cutting through the protective armor she had built around herself. With every recollection, she felt as though she were tearing open an old wound, exposing it to the light. But this time, she didn't step back. She was no longer the silent victim. Emily wrote down every detail, nodding after each answer, her eyes filled with focus. "We need evidence," she said with certainty. "I've requested the surveillance footage from Starbucks and the bookstore. If the police have nothing to hide, they will have to provide the data. If they refuse, that only proves they're trying to conceal something." A chill ran down Vanessa's spine as she thought about the possibility of them manipulating the evidence. She had seen too many similar stories, too many cases where the victim never had a chance to prove their innocence. But Emily wasn't like the others. She wasn't the type of lawyer who just talked big. She had fought this system before, and she wasn't afraid. "They have no evidence against you," Emily continued, flipping to another page in her notebook. "All they have is a vague description of a black woman, something they can pin on anyone. We're going to use that." Vanessa swallowed hard, her hands clenching tightly on her lap. "Do you really think we can win this?" Emily paused for a moment, locking eyes with her. "Not just think. I know we can win." For the first time, Vanessa felt a new strength stir within her. It wasn't fear anymore. It wasn't despair. It was the quiet rage, the hunger for justice that she had once thought she could never have. "All right," she said, her voice stronger than it had ever been. We'll fight." Emily smiled, as if she knew this was the moment Vanessa had finally found herself again. This was no longer just her battle. This was a battle for the truth. On a weekend morning, as Vanessa stepped outside her apartment, she was taken aback by the sight of a small group of residents standing in front of her building. They held small signs with phrases like "Justice for Vanessa" and "End Racism." These were her neighbors, the people who had heard her story and felt that this could not continue any longer. Among them was a middle-aged woman named Linda, who began chanting, "We stand with Vanessa." And in that instant, the group joined in unison, shouting her name into the bustling city streets. The pain she had carried for so long suddenly lightened, mingling with a hope she had never dared to dream of. These people weren't just standing by her. They were rising up to demand justice. However, despite the warmth and gratitude that filled her heart, Vanessa knew the road ahead was still long. A small group, a small protest, was not enough to change everything that had happened. She couldn't relax. She couldn't let this hope fade like a fleeting wave. But just as she felt a glimmer of light piercing through the darkness of her life, fear surged back. The following morning, as Vanessa prepared to head out, she noticed a police car parked in front of her building. The car door opened, and James stepped out, his face expressionless but his eyes sharp with menace. "Withdraw the lawsuit, or you'll regret it," he said, his voice as cold as ice, each word heavy with a threat. Vanessa froze, feeling as though a wave shattered inside her. The pain of being crushed, the unfair judgment she had endured for so long, surged back powerfully. But this time, she didn't let it consume her. She looked straight into his eyes, unwavering. "I won't withdraw the lawsuit," she responded, her voice firm with determination. "If you want me to regret it, I'll keep standing up. I won't back down." Vanessa's words felt like a declaration of war, and in that moment, she realized she was no longer the victim. She was a person fighting for the truth, and she would not let anyone extinguish the fire within her. The day the trial began, the courtroom was filled with expectant eyes. Vanessa sat silently, feeling like she was part of an invisible space, pulled into the legal debates that seemed to trap her without escape. Emily, her lawyer, stood strong, her sharp eyes fixed on the panel of judges. Every word she spoke was confident, every gesture deliberate and calculated. The video that Emily played on the large screen at the front of the courtroom brought the entire room to silence. It was footage from the bookstore security camera, showing the moment when James, the officer who had attacked Vanessa, lunged toward her and grabbed her wrist forcefully, pressing her against the wall with no clear reason. The scene replayed over and over on the screen, like a knife cutting deeper into Vanessa's heart every time she saw herself in it. The entire courtroom remained still, eyes fixed on the screen, but Vanessa knew, even though no one spoke, they were witnessing the indescribable pain she had endured, reliving that moment with her, second by second. She wanted to leave, to escape, but everything had already spiraled beyond her control. She couldn't go back to how things were before. She had to face the truth, no matter how much it hurt. Yet, in that moment, amidst all those eyes upon her, Vanessa felt something. This was her chance, not only to tell her truth, but to let all the pain and injustices she had suffered be heard. Emily's words were like a weapon, giving her a strength she didn't know she had. But even as the truth was being revealed, the pain remained, like an indelible scar, and Vanessa knew that regardless of whether she won the case today or not, her healing would be a long and difficult road ahead. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating, the air thick with anticipation as everyone waited for each testimony, each detail that would be revealed. Emily continued to guide the debate, her presence commanding. But the unexpected shift came when Ryan, James's fellow officer, stood up. His once confident posture was now strained, his eyes betraying the doubt that had crept in. He inhaled deeply, his body tense, as if the words he was about to speak were too heavy to bear. When he finally spoke, his voice was unsteady, the weight of his confession palpable. "James has a history of abusive power," Ryan admitted, his voice barely above a whisper, but it was enough to send a shock wave through the courtroom. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, the entire room seemed to freeze, time itself suspended in disbelief. Vanessa couldn't believe her ears. She looked at Ryan, and in his eyes, she saw the truth she had never imagined. the truth she had feared but could never have expected from someone who was supposed to be a protector. He wasn't just revealing the man she had thought was her enemy. He was exposing the very system that had failed her. In that instant, Vanessa felt her heart splinter. The confession she had longed for, hoped for, felt hollow now. She had waited for someone, anyone, to speak the truth on her behalf, to defend her before the world. But now, hearing it, she realized how much time had been lost, how much damage had already been done. Yes, the truth was finally out in the open, but the scars, both visible and invisible, remained. The pain of her experience, the humiliation, the injustice, couldn't be erased by a simple admission. Her soul screamed silently, the question echoing in her mind. Why did no one speak up sooner? Why had no one seen the pain she had endured, the torment she had lived through every single day? Why had no one had the courage to stand up for her when it was most needed? The realization hit her with full force. She had fought alone for so long, with no one willing to stand beside her, no one willing to speak the truth. Ryan's confession didn't bring relief. It only amplified the weight of her suffering. She felt the injustice surge within her once more visible, more undeniable than ever before. But it wasn't just the truth being revealed. It was a truth that felt like a wound reopening. In that moment, Vanessa felt the loneliness consume her, pressing against her chest like a physical weight. She was alone, even though the truth had been set free. The courtroom full of people could do nothing to change the isolation she felt. She stood there, surrounded by eyes that had just learned of her pain, but in that moment, no one could truly understand what it meant to be her. She wasn't just the victim of James's actions. She was a woman who had been failed by the system, by society, and by those who had the power to help her but chose to stay silent. The truth had come to light, but the road to healing was still a long and uncertain journey. And as Vanessa stood there, her heart heavy with the weight of it all, she realized that this wasn't just a fight for justice. It was a fight for her own voice to be heard. And she would continue, no matter how long it took. When the jury finally stepped out and the verdict was announced, the air in the courtroom became suffocatingly still. Vanessa stood there, her heart filled with confusion, her legs feeling as though they had lost all strength. When her name was called and the announcement was made that she had won the case, awarded $1 million settlement, a part of her wanted to cheer, to explode with joy, because this was a victory she had waited for her entire life. But that didn't happen. She stood there, looking at the faces around her, hearing the verdict but not feeling the joy. Tears silently rolled down her cheeks, not from happiness, but from a different kind of pain, the kind of pain that no amount of money could soothe. Yes, she had won, but this victory did not bring the healing she had hoped for. She had endured wounds that were too deep, too heavy to feel complete happiness. Money couldn't restore the stolen moments, couldn't heal the scars left on her soul by racism and injustice. She thought of all the people who had stood by her, but she also thought of all those who had turned their backs. She thought of the sleepless nights, the moments when she had to face baseless accusations alone, the distrustful glances, the never-ending battles. Her soul was no longer intact. It had been crushed too many times. And even though the truth had finally been acknowledged, even though justice had been served, the pain remained. It had become an everlasting scar, a part of her, reminding her every day of what had been. In that moment, Vanessa realized that victory did not always bring healing. But at least she had fought. And in her heart, that was what mattered most. After receiving the verdict, Vanessa refused to remain idle in her victory. The settlement, $1 million, was not just compensation for the suffering she had endured. It was the key that unlocked the door to the dream she had nurtured for years. With Emily's help, she found a small shop on the corner of a street where sunlight poured through the windows, radiating warmth in the heart of the cold city. Her bakery, Vanessa's homestyle confections, began to take shape, built by loving hands, filled with the aroma of fresh pastries and the stories she carried within. Every baked good, she didn't just create sweet treats. Each pastry carried with it a part of her story. With every knead of the dough, every placement of a pastry in the oven, Vanessa was not just making food. She was healing the wounds within herself. The pastries bloomed, soft and sweet, much like how she was slowly finding herself again, day by day. The struggles and bitterness of the past had transformed into the motivation she needed to perfect each pastry she made. Customers came not only for the delicious desserts, but also for the story behind them. A story of a woman who had fought against prejudice, unjust words, and inequality to stand tall. They came to feel her resilience, to sense the beauty hidden behind the pain. The story shared, the words of encouragement, and the support from the community created a warm atmosphere where each pastry became a symbol of rebirth. Each time Vanessa saw a customer enjoying one of her pastries, she felt like she had achieved something profound, not because of the money, but because of the affectionate glances, the genuine smiles she received. She wasn't just selling pastries. She was selling hope, resurrection, and belief in a future free from the darkness of the past. Vanessa knew that her journey was far from over, but at least she had found a place to start over, a place where she could live true to herself and to the people around her. One morning, just like any other, Vanessa was preparing fresh pastries when the bell above the bakery door rang, signaling a customer. She looked up and saw a familiar face standing at the door, head bowed. It was Ryan, the police officer who had witnessed James's wrongdoings but had never spoken out. Vanessa's heart tightened, not because of his presence, but because of the vague, uneasy feeling it stirred in her. Ryan stood there, looking awkward, his gaze fixed on the floor, his eyes filled with regret. Finally, he stepped into the bakery and looked at Vanessa with a face full of remorse. Vanessa didn't rush to speak, simply observing him in silence. Ryan walked closer, unable to lift his gaze from the ground. "Vanessa," he began, his voice small and shaky. "I came to apologize. I know I was wrong for not standing up from the beginning. I let you suffer too much." She didn't immediately respond. His late apology felt like a wound being reopened. Old pain couldn't simply vanish because of a few words. But she understood that no matter how late it was, these words were the first step for her to free herself from the past. She looked up, meeting Ryan's gaze, her voice low as she spoke. "I used to want to hear those words so badly. But now, I don't need them anymore. I forgive you. Not for you, but for me. Because I need to free myself from all this pain." Ryan stood frozen, as if her words had struck him deeply. He lowered his head once more, as if carrying the full weight of the regret in his heart. Vanessa didn't feel like the forgiveness was enough to heal the wounds within her, but at least it had opened a new path, a path that wasn't about holding on to the past, but moving forward. "Thank you," Ryan whispered. And before turning to leave, he glanced at the pastries on the counter, his eyes still filled with regret. Vanessa stood there, a sense of relief slowly filling her heart. Forgiveness wasn't about forgetting, it was about moving on. She had forgiven Ryan, not so he could be absolved, but so that she could release her soul from the burdens of the past. As the days passed, the change within the community became increasingly evident. Vanessa's bakery was no longer just a place to enjoy delicious treats. It had become a symbol of strength and resilience. The people in the neighborhood who had once looked at her with suspicion now visited the bakery, not only for the sweet pastries, but for her story, the story of a woman who refused to bow down to injustice. The community began to see her in a different light, no longer as a victim of racism or prejudice, but as an example of perseverance, a woman who had overcome everything to reclaim her strength. On mornings at the bakery, customers didn't just talk about work or family. They spoke of Vanessa's story, a story they couldn't forget, one they felt proud to be part of. The glances, the smiles, and the words of encouragement from the customers gave Vanessa the confidence that she was no longer alone in this fight. The heart-wrenching pain she had once carried, the wounds that could never be erased, had now become a beacon for others. She knew that her rebirth was a living testament to those who still felt lost, to those still searching for hope. But despite the overwhelming support from the community, Vanessa knew that the scar would always remain. The painful memories didn't easily fade, and the sense of injustice still lingered in her mind. Every time night fell, she would never be able to forget what had happened. But she had learned how to live with those scars. They no longer held her back. Instead, they had become valuable lessons, a source of strength that pushed her forward. And though the wound was still there, Vanessa had found a way to turn it into her power. Because she knew that in this community, she wasn't just a survivor. She was someone who had shown everyone that no matter what, we can all rise from any pain. Vanessa began a new chapter in her life, a chapter not only dedicated to her bakery, but also to speaking engagements where she shared her story with those who had never had the chance to stand up. She was no longer just a baker. She had become a source of inspiration for those who had experienced pain like hers. Her talks were no longer filled with complaints or dwelling in sorrow. They became empowering messages, reminders that no matter how cruel life may be, we can still find the strength to rise again. Vanessa spoke about the terrifying moments she had endured, but now, each word she spoke was a spark of hope for those still living in darkness. She wasn't just connecting with those who had lost hope. She was helping them realize that pain could be transformed into strength, that it was possible to be reborn from the deepest wounds. Through her words, Vanessa became a beacon for others, showing them that resilience wasn't just a concept, but a living, breathing force that could change lives. One evening, as the lights of the bakery began to shine, Vanessa stood at the door, gazing at the passing crowd on the street. The regular customers had become part of her story, and now they didn't just come for the pastries. They came for the transformation Vanessa had undergone, for the impact she had made on herself and her community. She smiled, but tears still fell, not from sorrow, but because she had achieved something she once thought was impossible. The pain, the scars, had become a part of her, but instead of pulling her down, they had helped her rise stronger. Vanessa had turned her pain into something meaningful, and she knew that her soul was no longer crushed. It had found the light, and from that point on, she continued to move forward, stronger than ever before. Vanessa's story concluded with a profound message, not just for those seeking justice, but for all those who were hurting and feeling hopeless. From heart-wrenching pain, a broken soul can be resurrected, leaving a legacy for those who dare to believe in justice. Vanessa hadn't just won her case, she had won her own destiny. She proved that despite the challenges life may throw at us, with the power of faith and perseverance, nothing is impossible. Thank you for staying with us through this powerful journey. Vanessa's story is one of resilience, strength, and the unwavering pursuit of justice. From the depths of pain and despair, she transformed her suffering into a beacon of hope for others. If you found inspiration in her journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps spread awareness and fuels more stories that shine a light on truth and justice. Together, let's continue to inspire and stand for what's right. Thank you for being a part of Emotional Journey, where every story has the power to change lives.